Hi folks, HR Funk here, with a video that I've been waiting for about 8 months to produce. In fact, I've probably been waiting a lot longer than that to produce this video, and if you've been watching the channel for any amount of time, you know that something that I have an affinity for is historically significant firearms. And those words definitely apply to the subject of today's video. What I have here is the Walther P99 AS, and you might be saying to yourself, well, why is this something that I've been waiting for 8 months to produce when this handgun has been available for about 26 years now? The reason for that is because at the SHOT Show this year, 2023, Walther announced that they are going to be issuing the final edition of the P99 AS, which is what I have here. And I've been waiting very impatiently since January for these handguns to become available. And in fact, this one has been on order for about 3 months, and finally they are here. And in this video, I'm going to be talking extensively about the P99 AS. I'm going to talk about the reasons that it was so innovative when it was introduced back in 1997. I'm going to talk about some of its heritage, and I'm going to talk about why this handgun maybe never really was as popular here in the United States as it might have been. So this is not going to be a short video. If you're someone who doesn't like videos longer than about 5 minutes or so, you might as well click out now, because this is going to be a deep dive into the Walther P99 AS, and it's going to be the kind of review that this handgun deserves after over a quarter century of distinguished service. So here we go. So here at the outset, I'll say it's hard for me to believe that the Walther P99, and specifically the AS version, is being retired as of this year. In fact, the production run has probably ceased at this point, because I think part of the delay in these handguns coming available had to do with the fact that Walther was essentially waiting until all the handguns were sold so they could complete their production in Germany, ship one shipment of these handguns to the United States, and that was going to be that for the P99 AS. Now, there are probably still quite a few available to be purchased, but I think production has probably ceased at this point. But as I said, it's hard for me to believe that it's being retired, because when you look at this handgun with its lines, and particularly when I get into talking about its features and functions, it could have been manufactured and introduced 26 days ago rather than 26 years ago. Really, the only modern feature that's missing from the P99 AS is some sort of an optic mounting system. And with as prolific and popular as that particular feature has become, it is something I notice quickly when you look at this handgun that it doesn't have. Otherwise, as I said, it looks very, very modern, and its features are still completely relevant. Walther has gone on to create some newer handguns that are largely based on the developments that were incorporated into the P99. The PDP and the PPQ both are evolutions of this handgun, and I really don't like them as well as I like the P99. They've gone to a bigger, blockier slide, which I don't care for the looks of. Now, maybe there's some engineering reason behind having that, I don't know, but I don't care for the way it looks as much. I much more prefer the sculpted lines of the slide on the P99. And they've also dumbed down the action somewhat. Now, a lot of people really like the Walther, and I'm going to try to use the proper German pronunciation throughout this video. The Walther actions are something that a lot of shooters really like. They like that short, light trigger that is sort of characteristic of the newer Walthers, and really that was largely pioneered in this handgun, although this trigger system is significantly different, and I'll get into that later in the video. But essentially, they took a handgun that had a lot of capabilities and a lot of options offered in the trigger that was incorporated into the design, and as I said, they dumbed it down basically so that shooters could have a single trigger pull and they could shoot the pistol really fast, and they really didn't have to think a lot about the application or, again, some of the capabilities that existed in these handguns when they were designed all the way back in the mid-1990s. Again, I'll get into all of that as we go. Now, some of you know there have been quite a few variations of the P99 design over the years. There have been different trigger actions that were included. There was the P99 QA, which was essentially a Glock action. There was another one that the actual designation doesn't come to me off the top of my head, but it was a double action only version with a long, heavy trigger pull every time. There was also a compact version. There was a 40 Smith & Wesson version. The final edition of the P99 is only being offered in the full-size 9mm AS version. So all of those past versions of the P99 have passed away. So much like the movie Citizen Kane, we'll start things at the end with a last look at the final edition of the Walther P99. As I said, this is the AS version. Now let's get on with the close-up shop review. And we'll start this look at the P99 AS Final Edition in the way that you bring it home from the store, which is going to be in this very nice hard case that Walther uses for its packaging. You can see it has heavy-duty latches. It is lockable. It is airtight, and it even has a pressure release valve in case you're taking it aboard an aircraft. And when we unlatch the case and open it up, we can see the final edition of the P99 AS itself, along with 2 magazines and a challenge coin, and we have an empty chamber indicator down there, and I'll pull this foam insert out and show you what's beneath inside the package. So moving those items you already saw off to one side, we can see the other items that come with the P99 AS Final Edition, to include 2 additional back straps, so you can get the proper fit for your hand by swapping these out with the one that's already installed in the pistol, which is a very simple process. All you do is drive out the roll pin at the bottom of the grip frame here, and you can remove the insert that's in there, install the one that's going to fit you properly, and then reinsert the roll pin. There are also 3 additional front sight blades of differing height that can be swapped with the one that's installed on the slide, so you can get the proper elevation for whatever ammunition you are using. And these are numbered, and the numbers are described in the owner's manual, so you can figure out exactly what front sight blade you need to get the proper elevation for your ammunition. There is the obligatory bicycle lock, a warranty registration card, a brochure for the National Shooting Sports Foundation, a little pouch for the challenge coin. I don't think I showed this before. There is a special challenge coin that comes along with the P99 AS Final Edition, and if you want to keep this from being scuffed or damaged or anything, you can put it inside the little plastic pouch. And lastly, there is an owner's manual, and this is a departure from some of the manufacturers that I've been reviewing products for lately, some of which are only including a link to their website, and you review the owner's manual for their particular handgun, rifle, shotgun, or whatever online. Walther is not doing that. They are including still an actual owner's manual, which I like. So all of these things accompany your P99 AS Final Edition when you purchase it. Turning our attention to the P99 AS Final Edition itself, we can see that this handgun has the OD green frame that was also utilized on the original P99s when they were introduced back in 1997, and that's really the only part of this handgun that harkens back to that particular initial production run of P99s. Everything else displays the advancements of the most recent P99s that have been manufactured. And I'll talk about these as we go, because some of them have evolved over time and some of them are improvements over those original pistols back then. But the P99 itself, when it was first introduced back in the mid-90s, was unlike virtually any other handgun that was available at that time. And a lot of the design attributes of this handgun really were the culmination of design features that Walther had been developing for decades to this point. And one of the things I had to decide when planning this video was exactly how far back into the company's history I wanted to go to tell the story of the P99. And at one point, I was thinking about going all the way back to 1886 when Carl Walter first set up his rifle manufacturing business, and then I thought, no, maybe that's a bit much. So instead, I'm going to start the story about 45 or 50 years later, when Walter developed the PP series of handguns, and the feature that was pioneered in those early handguns was copied later on by many, many manufacturers, and that is the trigger system. With the PP series, and of course this is a later manufacturer, PPKS, but the trigger system stayed the same. And with this trigger system, when the shooter loads a magazine into the handgun and cycles a slide, there's a round chambered and the hammer stays cocked just like a single action automatic. But then, in order to safely lower the hammer, the shooter can rotate the decocker as I did just there. The hammer will safely fall, this will not discharge the pistol, and then the pistol can be put back in the fire mode. And this is the way this handgun was intended to be carried. And this trigger system solves some issues, some real, some imagined, with the single action semi-autos that were available at that time, and some of which are still available today. Because with the single action semi-autos, either the chamber had to be kept empty until the pistol was going to be used, thereby delaying the time that it took to put the handgun into action, or if there was a round that was loaded into the chamber and the hammer was cocked, it had to be carried with a safety engaged, meaning that when the handgun was presented, the safety had to be disengaged before the pistol could be fired. With this trigger system, in this condition, this handgun is virtually as safe as any double-action revolver, virtually none of which have any sort of an additional safety device, or manually operated safety, maybe I should say. So when the shooter produces this handgun, all that is required to fire the first shot is a long, heavy pull on that double-action trigger, which both cocks and then releases the hammer. After that shot is fired and the slide cycles, the hammer stays cocked, and after which the shooter can fire any additional shots with a short, light, single-action trigger pull. So not only does this make it safer for this handgun to be carried and less complicated to put into action, but it also reduces the chance that under stress or a sudden startle that the shooter might accidentally squeeze off a shot when the handgun is in that double action mode. So there is a degree of safety added by this trigger system. And as I said, it was copied by many, many, many manufacturers in the decades following the development of the PP series, and I'm going to talk about some of them now briefly. So after the development of the PP series of handgun, Walter followed that up themselves a few years later with the development of the P38 pistol, which was the first full-size lock breech handgun to use that double-action, single-action trigger system. And that so caught the attention of the world that in the years following World War II, it was copied by Smith & Wesson. It was copied eventually in the 1970s, or I should say the 1980s probably, by CZ. And of course, it was copied by Beretta, and this handgun became the general issue for the United States military for several decades. In fact, it was just replaced a few years ago, all utilizing that same basic trigger system. And these weren't the only ones. Virtually every major manufacturer and a lot of minor manufacturers the world over adopted that double action first, single action for successive shot trigger system because it allowed that degree of safety that I talked about with what I'll call minimally trained personnel who could safely employ these handguns. They could effectively employ these handguns, and it made a lot of sense for anyone who wasn't going to get the high degree of training and specialized experience they needed to be able to manage a single action only handgun. So when Walter decided to design the P99, they didn't want to completely abandon that trigger system that they had been developing at that point for 60 odd years. And I'll talk a little bit about what they put into developing the trigger that ultimately became part of the P99. So during the course of the 1980s, not only the U.S. military, but many, many, many law enforcement agencies in this country and around the world adopted handguns utilizing that trigger system I was just describing. Then a funny thing happened. In the early 80s, an unknown company from Austria marketed a handgun with some very unusual features that initially were scoffed at. It had a plastic frame, which virtually no firearms in this country had. It had an odd grip angle that made it look sort of like a space gun. It was a striker fire system, which was kind of a little unusual for a handgun in and of itself. It was chambered for the 9mm cartridge, which many people back in those days still hadn't completely wrapped their mind around. And all in all, the Glock pistols out of the gates were sort of a novelty, maybe, and didn't catch on extremely quickly. But when they did catch on, they really caught on. And suddenly, by the end of the 1980s and moving into the 1990s, the Glock handguns had captured a significant portion of the market share for law enforcement here in the United States, and also around the world they were gaining more and more popularity. And some manufacturers tried to jump out quickly and come out with their own rendition of the Glock. One of those was Smith & Wesson. And here is a mid-90s example of that effort by Smith & Wesson to copy the Glock pistols. This is one of the early versions of the Sigma series, and this is the compact version. There was also a full-size Sigma, but this was basically nothing more than a copy of the Glock. In fact, it was such a close copy that Glock sued Smith & Wesson, and Smith had to make a couple of changes to their design in order to conform with the terms of the lawsuit. In any case, the thing that I wanted to point out with this handgun, since I don't have a Glock handy, is the difference in the trigger. Gone was the double action first shot and single action for successive shots trigger system that had been adopted by so many manufacturers over the preceding years. Now there was one trigger pull every time the trigger was fired. Now it's a heavier trigger with the Sigma than with the Glock, but for the first time now shooters are using this type of a semi-automatic handgun, and they're not having to manage that long heavy double action trigger first and then transition to the short light trigger after that. Once again, Smith & Wesson was the first one, I believe, to clone the Glock, but others followed after that. Walther, on the other hand, was not nearly so quick to jump out onto the polyframe striker fire bandwagon and try to come up with a Glock copy. As I said earlier, they weren't ready to abandon some of those design features that they had spent so many decades developing. So when Walther set out to design the handgun that would become the P99, they wanted to come up with a polymer frame striker fired handgun to compete with the Glock pistols, but they also wanted to keep it a distinctly Walther product. So as I said, they did not want to abandon some of those design components that they had been using for years and years and years. Now normally I talk about the trigger later on when I'm doing my top-down review of the handgun, but in this case I'm going to talk about the trigger first because it was one of the most unique aspects of the P99 when it was first introduced to the market. Now as we had seen with the Walther firearms leading up to that point, this handgun still, even though it's striker fired, has a double action first round pull. So the pistol is loaded, the handgun is cycled, or the slide rather is cycled. Then there is a decocker. In this case it's not a lever, instead it's a button on top of the slide, which allows the striker to safely move forward, just like when we decocked the hammer before. Now the first shot from this pistol is fired via a double action trigger pull. So there is that first trigger. After that, the slide cycles and the striker stays cocked, and now once again the shooter has a very short, light, single action trigger pull that only releases that cocked striker. By the way, this action was copied by Canik. For all you Canik fans out there, this is where they got the idea for developing the trigger system on those Canic pistols. And I'm a fan of the Canic pistols, but this is where it came from. The other thing about this handgun is if it is in double action mode, the shooter can retract the slides slightly. It only takes maybe a 1/16 of an inch, which will preset the trigger. Now notice the trigger stays in the forward position. So if the action is pre-cocked, just like this, and the shooter wants to fire a shot, it essentially works like a two-stage rifle trigger, or you can bring the trigger back to that point and get that single action trigger pull for the first shot. This gives a highly trained shooter a lot of options on how to carry this pistol, and it even gives agency heads some policy considerations when deciding how these handguns are going to be carried. And this is actually something that I had to deal with because my department in 2000 adopted the SW99, which was the Smith & Wesson clone of the Walther P99. And these handguns, for anyone who doesn't know, were a collaboration between Smith & Wesson and Walther. Walther made the entire lower half of this handgun. In fact, if you look on the frame, you'll notice, let me change the focus here, you'll notice the Walther logo right there because they manufactured the frame and all of the frame components. The slide and barrel of this handgun were manufactured by Smith & Wesson here in the US. And for some reason my focus is not changing again. And this has the exact same trigger system that I just demonstrated with the double action for the first shot. Slide cycles, action stays cocked, so it's a single action shot after that. And if the pistol is in double action mode, the action can be preset or pre-cocked, and the shooter can have those same trigger modes that I just showed you a moment ago. This was my duty handgun for 7 years during the time that the department issued these handguns, and I put many, many, many rounds of ammunition through this handgun. It went with me to various types of training. It went with me to some SWAT training, to some firearms training. I shot it a lot on my own time, so I got to know this handgun very, very well, which is, again, just a clone of this handgun. So maybe at this point you're thinking, well, what do you mean, HR Funk, that there are some policy considerations regarding how these handguns are carried? Consider this. If you have, say, rank and file troops who don't receive any sort of special training, they get just the generic handgun training that everyone gets when they join an organization, it can be mandated that they carry these handguns decocked in double action mode for that inherent degree of safety that I talked about with the other handguns that have the double action, single action decocker trigger systems. On the other hand, if you have troops that are more highly trained, you can allow them to carry the pistol in the quote-unquote anti-stress mode, meaning now the action is pre-cocked, the trigger still has a long pull for a degree of safety, but it is a much lighter trigger to be released. So consider SWAT team members, consider special troops, maybe hostage rescue teams or anti-terrorism squads around the world or what have you, have the ability to carry the handgun in that mode. Now something else. With the Glock style actions, as I said before, there is only one trigger pull. You get whatever trigger comes on your handgun, and that's what you have for any situation you're in. Which actually was a departure from something that police officers and people in the military had had for many, many years, because from the revolver days, there was the ability to put your handgun in single action mode if you needed to in order to take a very precise shot. Now, I will say the times that that might be necessary are going to be very, very, very limited, but there was still the ability to do that. With this type of an action or the Glock action, there is no way to do that whatsoever. But with the P99, again, there is that ability to put the pistol in a single action mode to be able to use that short, light, single action pull to fire the most precise shot possible. So again, there are a lot of options for shooters to be able to utilize when carrying this particular handgun. And as I said, in the mid-90s, there was nothing like the P99, and really there hasn't been anything like it since. So this is a unique handgun. I wanted it as part of my collection because it is the end of an era, and there was so much innovation and heritage that went into the development of the P99 that I just think it is a tremendous, tremendous handgun. It's a testament to Walther and their design capabilities, and also it's a tip of the hat to what developed their company going all the way back to the early days of the 20th century. So with all of that history out of the way, let's start our top-down look at the Walther P99 AS Final Edition. And if I didn't say it before, the AS stands for anti-stress, and that specifically refers to that pre-cocked action with the long trigger to help avoid, again, a startle response where someone accidentally squeezes off a shot that they didn't intend to. In any case, starting at the top, we have a 3-dot sight system, which for the mid-1990s was pretty much the state-of-the-art. Many manufacturers, if not most, utilized some version of this sighting system. Of course, Beretta famously used the 2-dot system on the M9, but they were a departure. The top of the slide is grooved to help cut down any sort of glare. The slide itself is finished in a melanite, and I'm trying to remember exactly what Walther called this because it's a black oxide finish. They didn't call it melanite. They used the same term as Glock did, and it just won't come to me right now. But essentially, it is a very durable finish that is almost completely impervious to rust, corrosion, etc., etc. On the early P99s, the slide was a lot blockier. On the later models, like we see here, the slide was reduced here at the front, and this nice contour here also operates to be able to do a press check if you want to do that from the front. On the rear of the slide, we have some fairly pronounced slide serrations, and they are definitely functional. This is also something that changed over time. In the original P99s, these were much more reduced. Something I should have mentioned about the rear sight before is it is adjustable for windage, and this is something else you didn't see and still don't see with a lot of polyframe striker-fired handguns. So not only could you adjust the windage for your ammunition, but you could also adjust the elevation, as I mentioned way back at the beginning of the video, by swapping out the front sight blades. Now there is an Achilles heel to this rear sight, and I know this specifically from when my department issued the SW99s because I saw this happen with a couple of our handguns. If the rear sight receives a blow of just the right force from just the right angle, it can break this little piece right here, and the rear sight will essentially fall out of the slide. It's rare, but it can happen, so just be aware of that if you carry a P99, or particularly if you're going to be using it in some sort of harsh environments. You can't see it right now, but the extractor on the P99 has a loaded chamber indicator. In fact, let me grab a dummy round and I'll show you exactly how that looks. So here we go. I'll load that round of dummy ammunition into the chamber, and you can see this sliver of red paint here at the rear of the extractor, now indicating that we have a loaded chamber. I've said many, many times I am not a huge fan of these, although I will say that's one of the brighter strips of red paint that I've seen. Usually these are barely visible, and there's really no tactile way. Now maybe if you are very careful, you can feel that this rear portion of the extractor is a little farther into the slide than it normally would be, but for all intents and purposes, there is not a tactile way to determine whether or not you have a loaded chamber. But in any case, this sliver of red paint, and I'll try to get that so you can see it again, does serve as a loaded chamber indicator. Moving on, we can see the various proof marks in the slide, along with the Walther legend there at the front for Fort Smith, Arkansas. Turning it around, we can see the logo and all the markings to include the Final Edition marking right there. Moving down to the frame, we can see the slide lock here. And interestingly, there is no guard around there, and this is a relatively long, wide slide lock, so you need to be careful when you're shooting this type of a handgun that you're not getting a thumb up on there, which under recoil could cause you to inadvertently lock the slide open when there's ammunition still in the magazine. Most of the time that's probably not going to be a problem for most shooters, but it is something to be aware of. Interestingly, on the SW99, which again was made by Valter, at least the bottom half, they did put a guard around that slide stop. So I'm not entirely sure why they never incorporated that into the SW99 itself, but for whatever reason they did not. Next we see the ambidextrous magazine release levers that are more or less wrapped around the sides of the trigger guard. And this is something, when I carried the SW99, I got to really like. Now the SW99 has the shorter magazine release levers that were the same as the early P99s. And what I would do during a reload, I would come back and I would hit that lever right there with my middle finger of my shooting hand, and it was very quick to be able to release that, and it required very little as far as turning the handgun in my grip or anything else. So I could more or less maintain a good shooting grip, come back, release the magazine, reload a new magazine, and be firing again very, very quickly. So I liked that a lot. Valter on the P99 lengthened these with one of the upgrades they did in the mid-2000s. And I think some shooters like to use their trigger finger for that. For me, that feels a little bit more awkward. I still like my middle finger to be able to come back and release that magazine. Again, very, very quick, very, very positive, and helps you to complete your reloads very quickly and efficiently. The trigger guard itself is large and roomy for gloved hands, and something that was changed inside the trigger guard over time. With the original P99s, there was this hump in the trigger guard, and as I understand it, this was supposed to be for gloved hands to keep the glove from getting stuck underneath the trigger while it was cycled. And eventually Valter just did away with that and made the bottom of the trigger guard smooth. In the front, we see some grooves on the front of the trigger guard for anyone who still prefers that finger forward hold. And we also see a single groove equipment rail. Early on, this was a proprietary rail that Valter used, and eventually they changed it to a more universal rail so you can accept a wide variety of accessories on this rail as opposed to the proprietary accessories that were offered only by Valter. The grip profile of the P99 is something I always liked, and it is virtually identical to my SW99 with only a slight change in the texturing. But we see the grooves on the front strap, some stippling along the sides that it's carried over into the back strap. And the P99, for anyone who doesn't know it, was the first handgun. This is another one of these innovations that was incorporated into the P99. It was the first handgun to use interchangeable back straps. So when you think about all the manufacturers out there these days that are offering interchangeable back straps and grip inserts and all that kind of thing, it started with Valter and the P99. And that ability to customize the grip to the shooter's hand has been so popular that it has caught on virtually throughout the entire industry. Again, this was the first handgun to do that. As I mentioned earlier, to change this backstrap, you simply drift out this pin. This backstrap will come out. You can put the one in that you want to use, reinstall the pin, and you're all set to go. So it's a very, very simple process. Wish I could demonstrate it, but of course YouTube won't permit that. In any case, you can see here that I did put the large backstrap onto this pistol, which is the one that always fit me best with the P99. That allows me to point this handgun very, very naturally, and it also positions my finger just where I want it on the trigger. And with the P99, I have that exact same feel, so I like that. I also like the fact that the places here where we have the made in Germany markings on either side of the frame make a great index point for a thumbs forward grip or for your trigger finger if you want to have it outside of the trigger guard during administrative handling. So I like those. I don't know if that was intentional or if it just happens to work out that way, but regardless, I like that as well. Looking at the magazine well, there is very, very slight beveling to the magazine well, but there is this shelf right here which helps to guide that double column magazine into the magazine well. That works very well. The magazines themselves are very high quality steel magazines. They have witness holes for almost all the 15 shots. Looks like it starts with number 4 through 15. And these magazines are virtually the same. In fact, the SW99 magazines are interchangeable, as best I can tell. And this has been an extremely, extremely reliable handgun. The P99s are known for their reliability. A lot of that comes from these magazines, and I don't expect to have any functioning problems at all with this pistol when I get to the range. So let's go ahead now and get a look at the pull weights on these 3 different trigger modes of the P99. And I've got my Lyman trigger pull gauge all set up and ready to go. And first we'll try the double action pull. We can slowly see the striker protruding. And 9 pounds, 3.8 ounces. Not bad for a double action trigger pull. Let's try another one. And see if it's about the same. Try to go a little faster this time. 9 pounds, 3.5 ounces. It doesn't get much more consistent than that. Okay, let's try now the anti-stress mode. So this is with the trigger in the forward position, but the action pre-cocked. And that pre-cocked trigger set at about 2 pounds. We'll see where it breaks. A little heavier than I expected it to be. 5 pounds, 9.1 ounces. Again, let's try that one more time. Make sure I didn't over pull it at all. 5 pounds, 8.4 ounces, so about 5.5 pounds for the anti-stress trigger. Now, let's try the single action trigger. And I would expect this is going to break about where the anti-stress trigger broke. A little bit lighter, 5 pounds, 6.0 ounces. Let's try one more here. Hold on just a second. £5 pounds, 8.1 ounces. So again, right about 5.5 pounds for that single action pull, whether it's in anti-stress mode or single action mode. And for all of you who are interested in the trigger's reset, it is very close. There is very little forward movement whatsoever before the trigger resets. In general, the double action trigger is very smooth. Single action trigger has a little bit of creep. You can see there a little bit of pre-ignition movement of the trigger, and then it breaks. Now again, this is a brand new unfired handgun. With my SW99 with many rounds through it, that trigger is extremely smooth in double action mode. There is virtually no creep in the single action mode at all. And I was able to shoot this pistol very well back in the days when I carried it. Just for fun, I want to check the trigger pull weight on this pistol to see what the P99 may eventually develop to after I get enough rounds through it. Okay folks, I'm going to try not to belabor this here. I'm going to get 3 good trigger pulls, I hope. Here's our first double action pull. About 8 3/4 pounds, so the double action pull is not bad at all on this pistol with as many rounds through it as it has. Now we'll try the anti-stress pull, which again is probably going to be very similar to what we see with the single action pull, but we will find out. Again, the trigger sets at about 2 pounds. And I'm kind of surprised that does not feel like a 5-pound trigger. I would have thought that was closer to 4.5 pounds. Let's try the single action only mode. That's closer to what I expected. 4 pounds, 13.9 ounces. So about 4 3/4 pounds for the single action pull on the SW99. Again, with the number of rounds through this handgun, this trigger feels very, very, very good. I can't overemphasize that. When it comes to weight, the P99 weighs in at 21.6 ounces with no magazine. With an empty magazine, it is 24.5 or 6 ounces. My scale keeps going back and forth. Now let's load it up and see how much it weighs when it's fully loaded. And with a fully loaded magazine and 1 round in the chamber, the P99 comes in at 31.4 ounces, or about the weight of a Browning High Power unloaded. So weight-wise, not bad at all. And although the P99 was never really billed as a compact handgun, dimensionally and weight-wise, and even in capacity, it's pretty much in the same ballpark as a Glock 19. And last up here in the shop, we have the tail of the tape. The P99 has an overall length of 7.1 inches with a 4-inch barrel, a height of 5.3 inches, and a thickness at the thickest point of 1.3 inches. And that's going to do it for the up-close shop review of the Walther P99 AS Final Edition. And a few closing thoughts here at the end of this video. Now there is going to be a part 2 where we'll head off to the range with this pistol and see how it shoots. But as I consider the P99 AS here in the Final Edition form, it occurs to me this handgun was never really all that popular here in the US. And I think there are a few reasons for that. By the time this handgun was introduced in 1997, a lot of shooters had already bought into the idea of a consistent trigger that was going to be the same every time you squeezed it. And for what I'll call a general issue handgun, there's probably some merit to that thinking. But the P99, I don't think when it was devised by Walther was intended for the average shooter. The P99 was intended for highly trained operators who understood and could take advantage of the features of this trigger and be able to use it to their advantage. And for those individuals who mastered that trigger, I think this handgun offered a lot that you can't get with some of those other trigger systems. Even the US versions of the P99 were never all that popular. To my knowledge, my department was the only one in our area of Ohio to ever issue the SW99. And there was a Magnum Research version, I think it was the MR99 or something like that. I don't know of anyone who ever issued that. And I also don't know of any department, large or small here in the country, that ever issued the actual Walther P99. Now there might be some, so if you're aware of some, I'm not saying nobody ever did, but I'm just not aware of them. And even in my department, when we had the SW99, I was probably the strongest proponent of, and I've already taken it back upstairs, I was probably the strongest proponent of the SW99 because I understood that trigger. I understood what it allowed me to do as a shooter, and I shot that handgun a lot. There were other officers in the department who were sort of lukewarm to it, and there were some who just didn't like it at all. Some didn't like the paddle style magazine release, which I came to really like. And it was just different enough, I guess, for shooters here in the United States that they wanted to gravitate towards something else, which is unfortunate because this handgun, as I've said all throughout this video, really offers a lot. And it's just hard for me to believe that it's finally fading away. And my feeling with the announcement by Valter to discontinue the P99 is very similar to the way I felt when I heard that FN/Browning was discontinuing the P35 high power. Now, obviously, the P35 was around for much longer than the P99, but again, that was another very historically significant handgun that was coming to an end, and we're seeing history repeat itself now with the P99. So if you're interested in one of these handguns, I would encourage you to start looking now while the final edition is still available. Now, due to the long production run of the P99, you might find some in the used handgun case at your local gun store. But I suspect those are going to dry up very quickly, and much like we saw with the high power, the prices are going to start going up and up and up. So if you want one of these, don't wait too long. Start looking now so you don't end up paying a lot higher price at some point in the future. And that's the video for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you purchase anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 7% off your purchase from Optics Planet. Also, remember the discount code from Hot Munitions. If you go to House of Pain, you can use my discount code there, which is HRFUNK10, and that'll save you 10% off your purchase from House of Pain. Also, don't forget the Target sponsor for the channel. Go to Target's online, check out their website, and see if they have anything that's going to meet your Target needs. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.